received his PhD from the Courtauld Institute of Art in 2018 on the subject of art, psychoanalysis, and the ethics of destruction in the context of the American AIDS crisis. He has since held 2 postdoctoral fellowships at the Courtauld and at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, DC, where he is currently working on a new project on sexuality, aesthetics, and coalitions of lesbian and gay artists in the USA in the 1970s. And he is published in Art History, Oxford Art Journal, the RA Magazine, Burlington Contemporary, and The Conversation. So I will hand over to Theo. Thank you so much, Theo.
Thanks so much, Catherine and Amy and everyone behind the scenes. It's an honour to start this final day of the conference. I'm just going to get going because there's a lot to get through. A UK Health Education Authority poster, first distributed in 1989 and here reproduced in the Manchester-based popular gay periodical Seen Out in January 1990, shows the head and shoulders of a bald figure, its sinuous musculature hatched out in etches on the page. Annotated with sections mapped out in dashed lines, echoing the conventions of anatomical drawing, Figure 1 is alone in the visual field, the word imagination branded on its head, standing synecdochally for the brain. The caption proclaims, "There's one part of the body that makes safer sex more enjoyable." The small print continuing, "We've all got one, it's just a case of how you use it. A little imagination can make all the difference to your sex life. It can help you find alternative ways to enjoy each other. Mutual masturbation, fingering, massage, and body rubbing are just a few you may have already thought of. But there are plenty of others you won't have, and half the fun is discovering new ways. And because it's safer sex, you'll find it easy to relax, as you won't have HIV or AIDS on your mind." The interface of the figure with the surrounding empty space is then an invitation to phantasmatic projection on behalf of both Figure 1 and viewer alike. The vast spread of blankness across 2 pages, presumably an analogue for fantasy's fathomless depth. Compare this isolated figure, eyes closed, denied any visual prompt to their imagination, to the visitor entering the space of ecstatic antibodies, resisting the AIDS mythology at Impressions Gallery of Photography in York in January 1990. The photography, video, and installation work is rich and sumptuous, poetic and enigmatic. Whilst clearly framed from the outset by curators Tessa Boffin and Sunil Gupta as addressing the representation of AIDS, much of the work's relationship to the epidemic is difficult immediately to interpret, especially in contrast to what Boffin and Gupta call the quote, representation of politics, the dominant hysterical coding of HIV/AIDS promulgated by the media. Ecstatic Antibodies is well known through its accompanying publication, successfully designed by Boffin and Gupta as its own intervention, eschewing the catalogue format to include a range of writers alongside contributing artists and reproduction of selected images in black and white plates. My aim today is to examine the quite different materiality and life of the exhibition itself, focusing on its censorship by Salford City Council, who preemptively cancelled its showing at the Viewpoint Gallery of Photography on Salford Crescent in autumn 1990, due to the ostensibly sexually explicit and pornographic content of selected works. Juxtaposing 3 archival traces of the same work animates the dynamic relationship between sexuality, censorship, and print reproduction that has determined the differing reception of the book and exhibition. First, Sunil Gupta's colour transparency of Rotimi Fani Coyote's The Golden Phallus as part of his and Alex Hurst's epic work, Metaphysic, Every Moment Counts, in the first room of Ecstatic Antibodies in installation in York. Second, Andy Gardner's photograph of ACT UP Manchester in October 1990 protesting the censorship of the exhibition at Viewpoint, wielding expediently assembled, blown up photocopies of The Golden Phallus and of one of David Ruffles' paintings to make their point. Third, the cover design for the book from River Orams Press, in which the sepia tone creates an all-over lustrous surface, rendering colours of white and patches of light tonally indistinct, similarly to Gardner's picture. Crucially, here, the publisher has cut the eponymous phallus out of the frame in a gesture of respectability to ensure the book could circulate without accusations of indecency. Given the clearly perceived necessity of that move, and that the Golden Phallus was chosen to protest Ecstatic Antibodies censorship, it's intriguing that the image was not the cause of controversy in Salford at all, which instead hinged on the question of the sexual content of works by Boffin, Gupta, and Nicholas Lowe. Aware of the work's material parameters, Fani Coyote and Hurst opted to reproduce only a handful of the 10 kyberchrome and 3 silver gelatin prints from Metaphysic within it, leaving out the 2 other constituent elements of the work. The praise songs, 10 panels painted with gold gouache and overlaid with sheets of acetate, printed with toner, showing texts in ornate calligraphic script that meditate on topics such as the blues, William James's concept of psiousness, and alternative medicine, as well as 4 painted icons of hybrid Yoruban and Christian iconography, holding open books and scrolls that comment on the passage of the work. The final panel here reads, "HIV doesn't have to be fatal, life is fatal." I want for the remainder of this paper to focus on the censorship in detail, but I've dwelt on the difference between Fani Coyote and Hurst's work in print and exhibition form to emphasize that much of the work in Ecstatic Antibodies demanded time, procession, and contemplation through the space to undercut, for example, the commonplace yoking of HIV as a fatal death sentence, and to offer instead the choice of moving with the virus through a life that by definition escapes one's total control. Metaphysic exemplifies the show's wider investment in the politically seductive possibilities of the materiality of photography, video, installation, a grassroots response making marked contrast to the blankness of the HEA's imaginary, the figure expected to undertake the task of reimagining sex and selfhood with no sensory prompts. This investment in materiality, I argue, developed in response to disinvestment in statutory response to AIDS across 1988 and 1989, and the Conservatives' fiscal choke of sexual minorities in Section 28 legislation and the poll tax. I do not want to suggest a simple dialectical relationship between top-down funding cuts and artistic response, but rather to explore how Ecstatic Antibodies' tour and censorship reveals the implications of Thatcherite assault on the power and autonomy of local communities for the possibilities of radical aesthetics and response to the AIDS epidemic. Section 28 had prohibitions on local authority spending for gays and lesbians written into its form, the injunction that a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality. The poll tax took an even wider aim. now popularly figured as the moment when the lower middle classes in England finally revolted against Maggie's iron rule, ghosted by protests in Scotland when it was introduced there the year previously, the poll tax can be more fully understood as a widespread pernicious attempt permanently to defund non-commercial cultural production and facilities at a local level. Boffin and Gupta curated ecstatic antibodies to challenge the paucity of representation enshrined in law in Section 28, and deliberately designed it with an iterative form in which, through its surrounding programming, the exhibition interfaced with the local context of cultural and activist response to AIDS in each of its venues, which included Impressions York, Icon Birmingham and Chapter Cardiff in 1990, Battersea Arts Centre, Street Level Glasgow, and La Maison de la Culture in Montreal in 1991, Worcester Health Authority in 1992, Gallery of Photography Dublin and Lighthouse Media Centre Wolverhampton in 1993. Its censorship in Salford, enabled by the political climate of Section 28, denied this community the aesthetic and political intervention offered by the exhibition. In the recollection of Jane Brake, exhibition's outreach officer at Viewpoint at the time, the decision to cancel was erratic and sudden. Brake had booked ecstatic antibodies by late January 1990 to show at Viewpoint in October, with the approval of Northwest Arts Photography Subcommittee, Association of Greater Manchester Authorities, which provided the local authority funding, and Salford City Councillors. In York, the work quickly became a source of controversy, as the visitor book began to gather comments that some of it was disgusting, and the local Conservative MP complained to the police, who visited the gallery and asked that Nicholas Lowe's work, Safe Sex Explained, have an adults-only notice pinned at its entrance. Lowe's installation dwelt on the negativity associated with safer sex practice as a loss of gay sexual pleasure. Enclosed in a 24 by 8 foot black box, the viewer encountered 4 suspended acetate and vinyl screens, projected onto, from either end, by 2 projectors showing slides of bodily close-ups and used condoms. Crumpled up photocopy reproductions of gay porn magazines from the 1970s carpeted the floor of the work. And it was these that prompted the local constabulary to request a notice at the work's entrance. As reported in the British Journal of Photography at the time, Denise Birkinshaw, the principal arts officer on Salford Council, got wind from Brake that police had been in the space in Impressions and began to express concern over the quote-unquote pornographic content in Lowe's work, the male nudes in Gupta's No Solutions, and the lesbians having oral sex. That's a quote from Birkinshaw, in Boffin's Angelic Rebels, Lesbians Have Safer Sex. The council officially cancelled ecstatic antibodies in June. Speaking to Creative Camera later in the year, Brake commented, quote, "The reason it was censored was because employees of Salford Council were afraid of being prosecuted under Clause 28. A council spokesman told the Pink Paper it was due to practical concerns, a lack of space. Quote, "Police in York felt that not all of it was suitable for staging in a private gallery. We don't want to impose censorship, but we have to bear that in mind. The Viewpoint is a public family gallery, and we felt that some of the material would be suitable for adults only. The setup of the gallery doesn't allow us to section off a room, so now I don't think we are going to stage it full stop." No doubt this explanation is chimerical, yet the importance given to space, or the lack of it at Viewpoint, is revelatory of the impoverishing effects of Section 28 on the material occupation of space for lesbian and gay artists. This denial of space counterpoints the ways that both Boffin and Gupta's works addressed the politics and creation of alternative spaces. The sexual content of Boffin's Angelic Rebels, Lesbians Have Safer Sex, was intriguingly disputed, Birkinshaw reputedly seeing lesbians having oral sex in the final image of the sequence of 5, reading the artist in codes, despite the clothing, through reference to the figure of ecstasy, being outside oneself in sexual pleasure. The angels also occupy an alternative space, one linked to London through the back projections of Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington, Eros at Piccadilly Circus, and the Wilton Diptych at the National Gallery, yet necessarily elsewhere, a fantasy black box scene. Boffin was originally to collaborate with Simon Watney to produce a work titled Exclusion Zones, considering the historical resonances of quarantine in British culture, set on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent, where in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, foreign ships suspected of carrying plague were held in quarantine in the mouth of the Medway. In Watney's recollection, both realised that this history lacked relevance to the context of AIDS in 1980s Britain, Boffin's fantasy space ultimately proving more immediately real to the epidemic and the urgent necessity to reimagine sexual practices. In Gupta's No Solutions, luscious colour reproductions of Indian calendar art are interspersed in a sequence of silver gelatin prints that show the artist and his boyfriend Steve embracing on a sofa, culminating in the final offending image of male nudes, which you can see on the lower right here. Here, domestic space in Brixton is the site of gay interracial embrace, a space of transgression, both of an imaginary of the white nucleated heterosexual British family and of Indian nationalism in the AIDS crisis, as explored in the accompanying quotes from the Director General of the Indian Council for Medical Research, advocating a ban on sex with foreigners for citizens of the Indian state. The coherence of nationalistic imaginaries collapses in Gupta's presentation of domestic space. The carving out of alternative space in the exhibition's photographic images was complemented by its programming, which aimed to continue the transmission of cultural theory and activism into the grassroots production of alternative modes of representation. Interactive workshop-style conferences in each venue across the run of the exhibition were designed to enable local workers to produce their own imagery and material interventions appropriate to the epidemic in their own local context. Salford and Greater Manchester were then denied this opportunity through the censorship of ecstatic antibodies at Viewpoint. The possibilities of creating space and imagery to imagine and envision sexuality, safer sex, community, otherwise, were shut down. Brake remembers Birkinshaw's mercurial attitude as an important factor in the censorship. Yet in 1992, she received damages from Salford Council for the popular reporting that it was her decision alone to cancel ecstatic antibodies. The council put out a clarifying statement that, quote, the decision to cancel was made by the City Council in the light of legal advice. The question of individual responsibility is less important than the fact that Section 28 clearly introduced a cultural legal climate in which erratic and sudden assumptions could be made that complex images were promoting homosexuality. It unleashed an irrationality that in group analysis, W.R. Bion called valency, the, quote, capacity for instantaneous involuntary combination of one individual with another for sharing and acting on a basic assumption. I want to finish by emphasizing that the censorship at Viewpoint also needs to be understood in the longer durée of stripping autonomy from local authorities in the late 1980s. The community charge, or poll tax, was designed by the Tories to replace the system of domestic rates that financed local authorities. The rates were progressive and proportionate, with homeowners footing the lion's share of the bill. This enraged Tories in Labour-run councils that had high rates because of large spending programmes, including on non-commercial community facilities and gallery spaces. The poll tax shifted the bill onto all adults in the local area equally, regardless of income or wealth. The idea was that high-spending Labour councils would bite on the pockets of more people in the area, who would, over the coming years, start to vote Tory to ensure lower local spending in an effort to keep the poll tax down. Thatcher called this system democratic accountability. In Greater Manchester, as elsewhere, both art and lesbian and gay spaces were explicit targets of these reforms. The Labour majority Salford Council established Viewpoint in 1986 as the flagship venue for photography in the Northwest. Part of a council effort to regenerate central Salford, Viewpoint was to house the Cultural Services Department's photographic archives, to exhibit historic images of Salford's industrial past alongside temporary exhibitions of local and national photographers' work, and to provide a library, darkroom facilities, equipment hire, and public lectures and screenings to improve access for locals to the arts. From Viewpoint's inception, local conservatives objected that it was not to be run commercially as a burden on ratepayer money. In April 1990, some charges for equipment hire and membership were introduced. Meanwhile, as it became clearer that the poll tax was a political disaster for the Tories, they tried to make much of the higher bills in Labour authorities as a result of irresponsible spending, with Manchester singled out in particular by Conservative Party Chairman Kenneth Baker. Quote, "In Manchester, they fine thousands of pounds for a gay centre, then wonder why the community charge is more than £420. Writing in 1990 on Viewpoint's cancellation of ecstatic antibodies, Simon Watney argued that, quote, "The increased targeting and policing of human sexuality is an attempt to restrict the range of choices we can make in our lives. This is one of the tragedies of contemporary Britain. The material shrinkage of spaces at a local level enacted through Section 28 and the poll tax were the key state mechanisms of such policing." Many of the papers at this conference have celebrated how marginalized artists managed to organize in the 1970s and 80s. These narratives are politically useful, but so also is reckoning with ambivalence, the ways that local possibilities for alternative spaces and futures, envisioned through radical aesthetics, were shut down as the wider social body was being reimagined as an aggregate of isolated individuals. That's it. Just quickly to say thanks to the following people without whom this would not have been possible: Sunil Gupta, Charan Singh, Emily Anderson, Joy Gregory, Nick Lowe, Jane Brake, Simon Watney, Flora Dunster, Fiona Anderson, and Laura Guy. Thank you.
This event. So, as said, I'm going to discuss Stephen Dwoskin's fluctuating relationship with the disability rights movement between the 1970s and the 1990s. But before doing anything else, I'm aware that I need to introduce Stephen Dwoskin, whose archive I'm working on as part of an HRC project. So Stephen Dwoskin, pictured here, was born in New York in 1939. In 1948, he contracted polio and spent the rest of his childhood and most of his adolescence in a rehabilitation hospital outside of New York City. He was brought up in Brooklyn. He became a successful graphic designer and on the side started making films in the ambit of the New York Filmmakers Co-op around Jonas Mekas in the early 1960s. In 1964, he moved to London on what was meant to be a temporary basis that became permanent. And when he was here in 1966, he helped establish the London Filmmakers Co-op. In this talk, I'll take 3 moments from the arc of his career from that point, how he became politically conscious, as it were, how that manifested itself in his films, and the difficulties that arose from this It'll necessarily be untextured because of the time. So to continue the story, having settled in London, Gorski built a reputation as part of the film underground, broadly speaking, the counterculture. His films were mostly, at this time, short portraits of women alone and sexually charged. Laura Mulvey, in her obituary of Steve Gorski, wrote that while she was writing her famous essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, quote, Steve's films opened a completely new perspective for me on cinematic voyeurism, and I wanted to incorporate them, particularly the film Trixie, into the article. This is a still from Trixie, as you can see. Gorski is often associated with gaze theory, not without reason, since in these films, the manifest gaze of the male filmmaker meets, as here, the returned gaze of the female subject, a look that wasn't part of the repertoire of so-called classical Hollywood, which was Laura Mulvey's main subject. The first moment in Steve Gorski's career that I'm going to discuss is what happened in the process of him making this film Trixie. Trixie with an E is a name, Beatrice Cordua Schoenherr, who was an avant-garde dancer who made the film Trixie with no E with Steve Gorski in 1970. At the time that they barely met when they shot this film. It's an extremely intense half-hour encounter between Trixie and Steve Gorski. It's Trixie with no E is probably the summit of these male gaze films. And after it, Gorski turned the camera on himself and inescapably on his disabled body for the first time in the film Behindert, made in 1974. This image here is to suggest, if you like, this returned gaze between Gorski's scene, or at least on my left, wielding a burly 60mm camera, and Trixie on the right. This is what he said in an unpublished interview about Trixie's role in this turn in his career towards turning the camera on himself. He said, quote, she was very involved in watching my disability. Trixie was totally infatuated, which she admits or says to me, with my disability. When I first started going out with her, it became she used to stare at me like a child, how I did things. So his interviewer, Antonella Iber, responds, I can understand that with a dancer, the way she uses her body. If you're a dancer, she works with her body all the time. To which Steve responds, well, I understand it. Intellectually, I understand it. But a lot of the staring gave me the feelings of how I felt when I first left the hospital, of how people stared at me. And it made me a bit self-conscious. It triggered off feelings that I thought I had gotten rid of. This was one part of the turn that he made about this time towards the film Behindert. Meanwhile, also in the spring of 1970, at almost exactly the time that he met Trixie, Gorski wrote an article for an American magazine called Design and Environment that was titled The Disabled's Encounter with the Environment, running through the basic facets of the built and made environment, including sinks, stairs, floor surfaces, and a car, as we can see here. And for this purpose, he had various photographs taken of himself, which he turned into drawings and which were published in the article. It was his first published statement at the age of about in his early 30s, first public statement on life with disabilities. He'd not really had the use of his legs since boyhood and walked with a pair of sticks and with calipers at this time. The published version of the article neutered the more troubling aspects of the draft version, fragments of which survive in the Gorski archive. He wrote at the end of this draft, one last point about the disabled in the environment. That point is how to expand the possibilities for them to participate in the social life of the community. Most authorities will consider helping the disabled in regards to training, getting and maintaining jobs. Many authorities still places social lives in a secondary position, if at all. This is inoffensive enough, but it didn't go into the magazine, and nor did plenty of the rest. I'd say that by using the phrase social life, Gorski was being euphemistic. In any rate, Behindert, which he began writing at this time around 1970, was inspired by this new or old self-consciousness that Trixie had brought on in him, but it is about the collapse of a sexual relationship between a disabled and a non-disabled person. But it is also about the other questions addressed in the article, questions of staircases and curbs and the built environment. Behindert, as in hindered, was made for West German television, not with Trixie, who was German, but with the actress she had introduced him to, Carola Regnier, who shot much of the film since Doskin himself was her co-star. The thing about the film, for my purposes, or for the purpose of this talk, is that Doskin made it without having had any recent contact really with other disabled people, and certainly without contact with organizations concerned with disability, still less any political organizations. Charities and so on had been part of his life growing up in New York, but in coming to London, he lost or cast off in certain respects all of his support networks, including his family and these sort of charitable institutions that were part of his adolescence. The film is almost literally mute. It's largely soundtrack, a kind of a drone soundtrack by Gavin Bryars. There is hardly any dialogue, and there is no explicit critique in the film. The staircases and the curbs that are obstacles are brute facts of life in the film Behindert. Its main focus is on the relationship, and it was, as I said, it was shown on West German television. It was not an obscure film, but it did not have even really an art cinema release in Britain. The next moment I'm going to address arrives in 1981, a few years later, a few films later, which had been designated as International Year of Disabled People by the United Nations. And this year saw Doskin's first involvement in any kind of activism on behalf of the disabled. The main public-facing part of this was his co-programming of a season of films at the National Film Theatre devoted to the screen representation of disability. It was not Doskin's idea. He was invited by Alan Sutherland, who was a film critic for Time Out magazine, who himself had epilepsy. At about the same moment that this was going on in 1980, Sutherland was involved in the early disability rights movement, namely the Liberation Network of People with Disabilities. He was also then writing a book connected with the Liberation Network titled Disabled We Stand, which propounded the then relatively novel social model of disability. My talk's title, Fall Down and Be Counted, comes from a film script that Sutherland was writing at about this time, inspired by his experience of epilepsy. It was Doskin who gave this film season its title, Carry On Cripple, which is characteristic in its lack of high-mindedness. The season itself was a serious endeavor with learned and balanced program notes. The majority of the films were Hollywood productions, but the only one definitely made by a disabled person was Behindert. Derek Malcolm wrote in The Guardian that the program had, quote, been roundly insulted in some public prints, possibly because of its ironic title. This was the case with New Society, a generally left-leaning weekly, who was eventually absorbed into The Statesman. New Society said, quote, oh dear, first Black Power, then militant feminism, now the cripple strikes back. It was not Doskin's first experience of film programming. He had run a film society when he was in rehabilitation hospital in the early 1950s, showing exactly the kinds of Hollywood film that predominated in Carry On Cripple. Program notes are critical of the films, but they treated them as worth seeing even when flawed. They said in their introduction right here, you can see that they didn't go for easy targets. Fundamentally, though, the films they wrote use us for their own ends, to startle or scare, to evoke sympathy or admiration of a kind we can do without. Apart from showing films, Doskin and Sutherland insisted that the National Film Theatre make itself more accessible to disabled people. Sutherland wrote in his book, which was published, I think, in the same year, actually, quote, eventually we got our way. The NFT constructed ramps, installed an induction loop system for hearing aid users, paid and provided facilities for interpreters, whom we nominated, and issued a detailed leaflet about access and facilities written by Steve and myself. The interview I quoted above about his relationship with Trixie, he did that interview. It was for private purposes. It was part of his preparation for what became his next film, which was conceived in parallel with the Carry On Cripple season and was finished in the same year, 1981, Outside In. Outside In is a kind of auto-fictional comedy in which Dworkin again starred, incorporating episodes from his own life. If Behinder was largely about a sexual relationship, Outside In is about the social life of a community, to use Dworkin's phrase from his article quoted earlier. What it sets out to do is make its non-disabled audience as uncomfortable as possible. It's a sequence of often mortifying encounters, some sexual, some not. And Dworkin himself plays an obnoxious version of himself as a kind of disabled Lothario. As in Behinder, he made no effort to elicit admiration. He did really the opposite. Unlike Behinder, Outside In has a fairly substantial amount of dialogue, though not infrequently, Dworkin is alone. He's encountering the built or made environment, the domestic environment, such as his own kitchen. At the end of the film, Dworkin, which the whole thing kind of quite regularly breaks the fourth wall in certain respects, certainly at the start. At the end, he addresses the audience directly, saying that he doesn't want to hear any criticism, that the people who made this film under intense difficulties, people who made it, quote, read every book, feminist, Marxist, leftist, rightist, uppist, downist, greenest, blackist. We are not concerned with that. We are concerned with the quality of motion picture and nothing else. So as with the season, which he deliberately gave a kind of a wind-up title, Dworkin sought to undercut his own claims to be taken seriously in a particular climate of British alternative film culture of the period, which was conventionally left-wing and usually fairly indifferent to disablement as a political issue. Dworkin was right at the core of alternative film culture in the 1970s and 80s, as a member of the governing council during the 70s of the Other Cinema, capital T, capital O, capital C. Nominally, the Other Cinema was a collectively run distributor/exhibitor, was responsible for bringing in films that were really outside the ambit of art cinema, but were typically, they were not sort of fully experimental or fully avant-garde films, and these films would mostly be shown by university film societies, but also it would run seasons in various locations in London before eventually running its own actual cinema.
Henry, I'm so sorry to interrupt as a disembodied voice, but I think your paper's quite near your microphone. So maybe you just, we're getting quite a lot of interference.
Good, sorry, I don't know where my microphone is. I'll bear that in mind.
No worries. Thank you.
Put it on the other side.
Perfect.
So yeah, the Other Cinema theoretically was a collective. In reality, it was a kind of a thunderdome of competing egos. Dworkin was friends with the central figures in this world, including Mark Carlin of the Berwick Street Film Collective. He collaborated with Mark Carlin on a film about the Other Cinema and its demise. So Dworkin was a central figure in this world of alternative film culture. But in the interview that I've been quoting, he referred to a tendency among some named individuals in this milieu who, aiming for a kind of egalitarianism, quote, think that you as a disabled person should do things yourself because if they help, they'll spoil you. There's a kind of parallel with the idea of colorblindness in this attitude. Later, Dworkin said they want films that say that political action is the answer to everything, anorexia, which he'd also made a film about, and polio. So Dworkin's was not a rejection of political action, but it was never going to be possible for him to adopt a purely activist perspective that was the perspective that was common among his peers in the Other Cinema. On the other hand, as I've said, the Other Cinema did not actually treat disability as a political issue. It remained more or less invisible in this environment until into the 1980s. So Dworkin, by putting on this season, which was novel in 1981, and by making this film, was making practical steps, but had to be a critic of the environment that he was coming out of. Like Behinder, Outside In was made for West German television. The BFI, which at that time was generally supportive of political cinema, would not come in even with a completion grant for Outside In. And I don't believe it supported other disabled filmmakers Fall Down and Be Counted. Alan Sutherland's script was also rejected. Interestingly, Rubina Rose, one of whose films was shown by Cinenova earlier this week, she was kind of involved in the writing of that, and I think was kind of possibly going to direct it at one point. I don't think that Doskin verbalized his oppositionism, his refusal to play the role that state funding bodies required of him as a disabled filmmaker. But part of it was his need to broach the taboo of disablement and sex. And it was this that eventually undid him in the 1990s. As I've suggested, Doskin was not a consistent activist. Alan Sutherland told me that he was temperamentally not a joiner. And there was also a culture gap. Parenthetically, it would be worth doing some sociology of what we're calling grassroots. In broad strokes, much grassroots activism does seem clustered around educational and cultural institutions, and this was Steve's constituency. But the liberation network of people with disabilities, at least to begin with, was less well integrated with this quite close-knit world, so far as I can see. I think there is more to be done there. But anyway, returning to the narrative, the third and last moment in this talk begins a decade after Outside In, when Doskin began contributing to a new magazine, Disability Arts magazine, on its launch in 1991. And when he made, in the same moment, a kind of essay film, Face of Our Fear, for Channel 4 as part of a season on disability called Disabling World. That was in 1992. And the project that I'm involved in at Reading showed Face of Our Fear a couple of months ago. I think it's still available on the Lux website. I think that this early 90s moment of Channel 4 doing seasons devoted to kind of issues like disablement, which had been marginal even 10 years earlier in mainstream culture, is indicative of certainly the new kind of culture that Channel 4 represents. And Steve Doskin had been associated with Channel 4 during the 1980s, but Disability Arts magazine was closer to the grassroots, if you like. And although the two projects dealt with media representations of disability, and although these two projects, Channel 4 and Disability Arts magazine, were closely linked in Steve's work, in some way, and in some ways, this was the high point of his visibility. Despite this, he used one of these media, he used Disability Arts magazine as a way of criticizing what he was doing elsewhere on Channel 4. So Disability Arts magazine was a kind of an Arts Council funded endeavor, which began in 1991, and Steve was a kind of a stalwart contributor to it for a few years. But his early contributions were criticisms of kind of the other part of his working life, and particularly the difficulties that he encountered doing this film, Face of Our Fear, which involved a lot more bureaucracy, oversight, management than he'd been used to, because in return for the visibility of doing the flagship film for a Channel 4 season, commensurately there were new pressures exerted themselves. And Steve Doskin had set out, initially in the ambit of the New York and London co-ops, to really he'd not really experienced that kind of bureaucratic interference before. So just as the Channel 4 season was about to begin in March 1992, he wrote in Disability Arts magazine that, quote, "Personally, I am against this tokenistic presentation of work about and by disabled people in this way, an isolated and labelled way." And he continued in this vein, both about the season and related things. In 1993, the first European Disabled Film Festival held in Turin, he criticised these aspects of what is no longer a kind of a grassroots movement. He criticised the Channel 4 season for showing My Left Foot as its flagship film during the season, which was made by non-disabled people, and in his view was a sort of a fantasy of disabled life. There's no documentary evidence in what happened next in Steve Droskin's career in terms of his relationship with Channel 4, but it never really recovered. He would never have this visibility again, as he had bitten the hand that fed. Eventually, he came to treat the contemporary artist's dependence on state institutional support as, quote, both a metaphor and reality for people with disabilities. And in the same article, this is in 1994, he disavowed the public role of disabled filmmaker, which he had been called on to inhabit, i.e. treated as disabled first and filmmaker second. It was always something about which he'd had ambivalence, but at this moment in the mid-1990s, he pushes against the limits too far and is eventually ejected from the kind of the funded system. What he had sought, both in his as it were private life and in his artistic practice, was autonomy, and this idea of the contemporary artist's dependence as a metaphor, I think, was felt quite strongly. So his next commission but one, the film Pain Is from 1997, ended in acrimony. It was an essay on the various forms of pain, and from the point of view of its sponsors, it showed too much of the enjoyment of pain. So this film was not shown on British television, and it kind of caused a rupture with his sponsors in France and Germany. Droskin's refusal to play the game entailed eventually a complex kind of marginality in a very different cultural climate from the 1970s. I'd say it's complex kind of marginality because having a pre-existing reputation based on his earlier work, he could never be completely marginal. But in the noughties and the early 2010s, he was largely without funding and found it difficult to have his work shown, especially in Britain during the aughts. I'm not sure that there was or is a grassroots to speak of in that period, this period. It's a concept to treat critically. But Droskin's digital works from 2001 until his death in 2012 were made collectively. He was no longer able to do all of the filming himself. And they are the uncompromising expression of someone coming to the end of a life, most of which was lived with a severe disability. The apotheosis of these films, The Sun and the Moon, which the stills are as gloomy as the film actually is, it has to be seen in a darkened room. The Sun and the Moon saw Droskin take the role of the beast, as in Beauty and the Beast, which was the basis for this film. Opposite Trixie, again, who is there visible on the right, a good 40 years after they'd first collaborated. He was, in a sense, liberated at last to use his body on film, not to win admiration or sympathy, to quote the disapproving words from the Carry On Cripple program from 1981, but to also use the words, he was able to use his body now finally to startle or to scare. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was, there's so much food for thought there to bring through into the Q&A, particularly I think around the complexity of political identification, whether that's self-identification or collective identification. And I really liked your call for us to think more critically about the term grassroots, who's included within that, who's excluded from that. So some really valuable points that we can bring through into the Q&A. Thank you. Our third speaker in this panel on confrontations is Ash Reed. So Ash, if you want to start screen sharing and popping your camera on, that would be fantastic. Ash is an MPhil PhD candidate at Goldsmiths, University of London, researching the histories and presence of feminist film distributor Cinenova. She also makes music, video and performance work, often in conversation with others, with recent shows at Café Otto and the Kunsthal Ghent. And I will now hand directly over to Ash. Thanks so much, Ash.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to Catherine and Amy for organising this, and thanks to everyone behind the scenes as well who's making it accessible and possible for everyone to join. And thanks to other speakers on the panel. I'm just going to read out this paper. So I'll try and not do reading out voice, but okay. In 1984, the Women's Independent Cinema House, or WITCH for short, were commissioned by the Cooperative Development Association to make You'll Never Walk Alone, a video that explored the history of cooperatives in Britain whilst documenting interviews with a range of housing, worker and consumer-based cooperatives in Liverpool at the time. Asking if it is possible to work without a boss. Oh, let's see if I can move my, oh, there we go. The video in many ways reflects the ongoing concerns of the city as a whole. The residents of Liverpool resisting the managed decline operated by Thatcher after the Toxteth riots of 1981. The workers answer candidly about the material conditions of the cooperative structure. Oh God, sorry everyone, I see a click, okay. With a worker from the food cooperative, The Dancing Cat, stating the need to become more businesslike in the face of the current recession and how hard it was becoming to pay workers' wages, and a worker at Vixen Press talking about the difficulties of juggling this kind of work without any childcare support you would normally get in a more standard workplace. The video in this sense is very clear in its views. Whilst cooperatives may give workers more control over the day-to-day running of a business, it cannot ever be separate from the financial demands of the wider economy, and they're certainly not the answer to the wider issue of unemployment rapidly spreading across the country at that time. In a recent panel discussion about this video in particular, one of the founders of which, and I'm sorry Judy, I'm going to pronounce your surname wrong, Judy Mazonovich, pointed out that co-ops tend to thrive under a Tory government because it means there is a fudging of the reality of employment rates and it turns everyone into a capitalist to varying degrees of success. A very big win-win for them, you could say. I've been thinking about this video and this statement a lot over the past year as the perceived egalitarianism of the free market and the idea of meritocracy it promotes come crashing down around us again, albeit rather more starkly than usual, making the altogether branding campaign of the latest Tory fight against COVID feel particularly moot. I had been writing another iteration of this paper at the beginning of the pandemic that was going to relate the funding narratives of projects like WITCH to current schemes like Arts Council England's Creative People and Places Fund, which seek to bring the arts to parts of the UK with the third lowest monitored engagement rate in them, a range of, in the Tories' eyes, arid, culturally deserted hinterlands linked by their shared lack of metrocultural subjectivities, and that's a real Arts Council monitoring term, to ask what exactly this draw to regionalism is specifically for extremely right-wing conservative governments, why this desire to force entrepreneurialism on areas it would also quite happily see rot. However, I'm not even sure this draw actually remains, as the current strategic prioritising of Gavin Williamson and his 50% cuts to arts education, combined with the very unstrategic emergency funding of commercial arts venues rather than the grassroots, would suggest they've finally given up the pretense of arts for all. However, we shall continue apace with what community might mean even under these current horrific auspices. I have been interested in how the concept of community art felt particularly operational and useful to neoliberal governments, like an injection of money for some participatory art projects would somehow appease communities being ripped apart by the continuing austerity measures of the ruling class. I've been thinking about this as I was, and still am, writing a chapter on community and collective video practices as they appear in the Cine Nova collection, a feminist distributor based in London and whose uncatalogued paper archive currently takes up a big chunk of my living room as I try and put it in some kind of order for my PhD. I had started thinking about Elizabeth Freeman's phrase in her text, Time Binds, where she talks about retroactivism as a mode of regeneration that aims to awaken the dissident and minor future once hoped for in the past. That was a quote. And I was thinking about the use of the word retroactivism in particular, about how in a moment where it wasn't that dissident and minor future being awakened, but rather a constant return to the stultifying urgency and firefighting of that past still present, In what ways does this ask us to think about these works in a different manner? I ask this at a time when also the art world is choosing to celebrate the idea of collectives again, with Juliet Jakes putting it best in her recent article for Frieze, where she says that this recent quote, turn to the collective is not so much a rejection of the concept of the artist as a response to a decade of funding cuts that have hit working class and marginalized people the hardest, end quote. Jakes's article is a response to the recent announcement of Turner Prize nominees, all socially engaged or activist art collectives who each work with and in otherwise marginalized communities, albeit in extremely different ways and to varying degrees of separation. I was struck in particular by a small section of a statement released by one of the groups, Black Obsidian Sound System, upon the announcement of their nomination, where they state that organizations like the Tate, quote, whilst enamored by collective and social practices, are not properly equipped or resourced to deal with the realities that shape the group's life and work. Boss, quote, see this in the lack of adequate financial remuneration for collectives in commissioning budgets and artist fees, and in the industry's inbuilt reverence for individual inspiration over the diffusion, complexity, and opacity of collaborative endeavor. I was struck by this as it made me think of a photocopy of an article from Feminist Art News that I'd found quite early on into my research. An article that is given over to two groups that are also franchise workshops under the Workshop Declaration, Vera Productions and Sinestra Pictures. Vera Productions, you might remember from Ed's talk in the first session, they produced Video 28, which documented many of the protests against the then called Clause 28. The article is called Feminist Independence at a Price. And I was tempted to use this session just to read Al Garthwaite from Vera Productions' take on the state of the workshop sector as an answer to my original paper proposition, as she answers it much better than I ever could. However, in lieu of doing that, I'll read out the section where Garthwaite pinpoints exactly the fallacy of community that this sort of institutional recognition brings. I caveat with it being written in the 1980s, hence some of the terms. So quotes, women, lesbians, Black and ethnic minority groups, people with disabilities, working class groups, and gay men may or may not want to work collectively and engage in integrated practice, but we can find sexism, racism, ableism, classism, and heterosexism so unbearable elsewhere that we are forced into it and thereby marginalized. It's also assumed that such groups will be co-ops and welcome being referred to as collectives. Not true of all, including Video Vera, who find this prevents our work being taken seriously by TV companies, the private sector, commissioning clients, and some funding bodies, end quote. As Jake states, what exactly does it mean to celebrate what is often a forced hand, and what is left in excess of the operationalized productivity of these groups? The declaration itself is part of a long history of radical film workshop movements in the UK, from worker screenings of the 1920s and 30s up to the communal filmmaking and distribution collectives of the 1970s and 80s. It was the result of lobbying done by the Independent Film Association, a group formed in the 1970s from an amalgamation of workers from the London Filmmakers Co-op, Cinema Action, and the Berwick Street Collective, amongst others. Throughout the 1970s, the IFA lobbied the Labour government to provide some sort of financial support for the less commercially viable film and video making the groups were involved in, resulting in a promise to fund a series of regional production units that would cater for long-term programmes of work rather than one-off projects in the new Broadcasting Act that was being written for the next term of government. But then, obviously, 1979 caused a huge disruption to this agreement, with Thatcher not so interested in the subsidy of the arts or film in this manner, or the arts in general, to be honest. The resulting agreement in 1982 was greatly scaled down from the original concept of regional outposts, instead becoming tied to content production for the then new fourth channel. Channel 4 itself was to, quote, encourage innovation and experiment in the form and content of programmes that catered for a marginalised audience otherwise ignored by the other 3 channels. Not all bad in a media landscape otherwise dedicated to promoting the breakdown of community and threat to the nation these types of audiences otherwise represented. An imaginary that justified the violently racialised policing of inner cities and draconian measures taken against protests and trade union action during the period. Channel 4 had this freedom mostly as it was free of the pressures of advertising revenue as a result of the relationship set up between it and ITV. And this meant that it had quite a lot of creative freedom in terms of what it could broadcast. The workshop declaration was another way of creating content for this while seemingly acting on behalf of the groups involved. It was drawn up by the channel, the BFI, the IFA, and the Association of Cinematograph, Television and Allied Technicians, which is now BECTU, the union, with, quote, the explicit belief and with the explicit intention of encouraging the cultural, social and political contribution made to society by the grant-aided and non-commercial production activities historically undertaken by persons and organisations in this sector, end quote. It was seen to allow, quote, cinema of practice, as it was called then by the ACT Deputy General Secretary, and a way of building new relationships with audiences as an antidote to viewer passivity. Can't pronounce words today. It also paved the way for the previously mentioned integrative practice model, a combination of research, development, production, and distribution, all controlled by the individual workshop franchises. The declaration supported 12 to 15 workshops every year, with 4 out of 5 based outside of London to try and address both the dominance of the capital over production and the lack of access more generally to paid, consistent work in film and video making across the board. Which was one of those workshops, a group that had started informally in Mazonovich's flat on Wednesday evenings to watch films and discuss their own projects. And it was in a flat out of lack of space and childcare provision. Formed with Sally Evans and Steph Bin, the 3 women met as part of the Skills Training and Enterprise programme of Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool, doing the photography, film and video course of the Merseyside Visual Communications Unit. After wishing to host screenings and invite filmmakers to discuss works from the collections of Cinema, Women and Circles, the 2 feminist distributors that existed before CineNova, the group formalised in order to apply for Merseyside Arts funding, also running photography workshops and raising money for women-only video making weekends. For over a decade, the group made a series of films exploring the lives of women in Merseyside, funded in part by grants that came from their recognition under the workshop declaration. The group also later split into 2 and formed Black Witch, a separate group set up to represent the voices of Black women in Liverpool. It was common for groups to start like this, with projects like the Sheffield Film Co-op arising out of feminist consciousness-raising groups and Black Audio Film Collective, part of the Black Film Workshop movement, forming while students at Portsmouth Polytechnic. These workshop and community projects brought a different voice into the world of video production and really did arise from the communities they represented on screen, suggesting that the declaration was successful in its aims, giving broadcasting time and money to socially and politically engaged community-led projects awarded on 1-, 2- and 3-year permits that paid workers at union accredited base rates and covered capital costs like rent and equipment. Sadly, as the cooperative workers of You'll Never Work Alone also discover, these radical frameworks still form part of a wider political and economic climate outside their control. And although this allowed for what Mazonovich saw as real films about real people, the original remit of Channel 4, the model was ultimately built on a neoliberal model that expected these groups to eventually fund themselves without reflecting on the fact that the workshops were already doing work above and beyond their own remits for free, and still without the respect Garthwaite mentions in the industry. It is independence, but it is at a price. Garthwaite notes that the integrated practice model asked of by these workshops would tend to translate into cheap part-time social work, especially in women's workshops, sideline work that stops the groups from actually being able to produce films and also covers for what might otherwise be missing in terms of state-funded community provision elsewhere. Whilst passing over the much needed financial capital to document and disseminate both marginalised and revolutionary practice is not something in itself to be criticised, these funds are at the same time interrupt other forms of production, using the ideas of meritocracy introduced by the neoliberal condition to both pitch groups against one another, whilst also allowing for the accumulation of value from the previously ignored forms of social reproduction of these groups, namely the mutual aid practices and free education solidarity networks the integrative practice model ends up replicating. There is something in particular in the use of the word community by the state which reifies groups of people into categories of inflexible identity, something which, in the words of Gillian Rose, construct the distinction between its members and non-members in a way that is intolerable for a radical politics, and something which must be explored further in regard to these examples. To understand the deeper implications of this, it is essential then to look at how this difference between an operative society the state tries to create with these models and what always remains in excess of this objectification of an otherwise radical form. As Paul Rodaway argued in his text, Centrist Geographies, television in many ways was the ideal medium for this type of social governance, acting as, quote, a peep show and not a dialogue that produced archetypal scenarios that only reinforced pre-received ideas of social construction. Community, he states, is not something that can, quote, arise from the domain of work. One does not produce it, one experiences or one is constituted by it as the experience of finitude. The work of retroactivism then is not to look at the objects themselves, but to ask what relationship and conversations happened and continue to happen as a result of these works existing. What else is distributed alongside their simple transmission? I'll leave this paper now in the words of Garthwaite again, when she's talking about the Women's Film and Television Video Network, which forms part of the article. And she says that the way this government's going, networking is our only hope, and it's fun too.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ash. That was a great quote to end on. And thank you also for highlighting these questions and complexities around funding, which came through in both Theo and Henry's papers, but have also been a kind of consistent nexus that requires elaboration throughout Grassroots. Okay. I'm aware that we're running a bit late, so I'm going to introduce our fourth and final speaker for this panel, Alexandra Kokoli, who will be giving a paper entitled Beyond Monuments, the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common as Feminist Heritage. Alexandra is an art historian who researches aesthetic mobilizations of discomfort to political ends, focusing on art practices informed by and committed to feminism. She works as a senior lecturer in visual culture at Middlesex University in London, and she's also a research associate at VIAD, the University of Johannesburg. Her research into the aesthetics of feminist anti-nuclear activism at Greenham Common is supported by the Paul Mellon Centre and the Leverhulme, and she is published widely in Art Journal, Oxford Art Journal, Women and Performance, and Hypatia, among other journals. Her books include The Provisional Texture of Reality, which is a collection of texts by Susan Hiller, and the monograph The Feminist Uncanny, which was published with Bloomsbury in 2016, and I highly recommend for anyone who hasn't already read it. And she's also the co-editor with Deborah Cherry of Tracy Emin, Art into Life, which was out with Bloomsbury last year. So I'm really excited to hand over to Alexandra for the last paper of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Amy, for this fantastic series of events, and to all of you for tuning in. This paper is a work in progress and will only engage with specific monuments and works that I see as committed to memory while being anti-monumental, and not so much theories of memory and memorialization. I'm also grateful to Nina Wakeford and Richard De Domenici for sharing valuable information about their work. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to my second slide.
If you use the arrows, yeah, that should work.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. The Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common, established in protest against the storage of nuclear warheads at US RAF base on previously common land, hosted a range of visual and performative actions and famously transformed the perimeter fence of the airbase into an impromptu gallery of art and visual activism. The camp deployed visual and performative strategies knowingly, regularly, and with widely recognized impact, leaving behind a rich archive of documentation. Since I told friends and colleagues that I'm researching Greenham, many shared with me their own photos, a proof that they were there, and an indication of the daunting archival sprawl of Greenham. Greenham was photographed compulsively by amateurs and professionals, supporters and detractors, stayers, visitors, and journalists. Here you see some photographs by Jenny Matthews, co-founder of Format, a photographic agency advocating a more gender inclusive and more militant kind of photojournalism, discussed in day 2 of Grassroots by Nama Klorman Iraqi. Format was founded in 1983 and lasted for 20 years, almost coinciding with the peace camp. The slides show examples of the range of activisms performed at Greenham Common, including the transformation of the perimeter fence into a studio and gallery on the left, non-violent direct action in the middle, and a feminist mobilization of history, stories, and symbols, exemplified by an indignant witch conversing with the authorities through a loosened or possibly breached section of the fence. In a very special feminist duration reading group session on the 12th of February 2020, Sasha Roseneal spoke about her experience as a Greenham woman and then Greenham scholar, pursuing a PhD on the peace camp some years later. Her PhD thesis became the book from which we read that day, Disarming Patriarchy, Feminism and Political Action at Greenham. From Sasha's insights, the one that resonated with me the most had to do with time. Time had a different meaning at the camp, she said, and recollection. It's difficult to determine when the camp ended, she also said. It was assumed to have closed a few times since the mid-90s, but a core of stayers at the Yellow Gate persisted until 2000, long after cruise missiles were removed, and they were removed by 1991, and after the airbase had closed the following year. Sarah Hipperson's correspondence kept at the Women's Library LSE also confirms the diffuse nature of the camp's dissolution. And since the late 1990s, her communications often correct the assumption that the camp had already closed. Hipperson and the Women of the Yellow Gate spent these last years actively fundraising and planning for a commemorative and historic site in discussion with local authorities. I found minutes of meetings between the Greenham-based company Soundabout Ltd and the peace camp, in which, quote, the offer of a building in exchange for closing the camp was debated as early as 1994. That proposal wasn't accepted, but it is clear that any negotiations about the closure of the camp had already become contingent on the development of an infrastructure for the preservation of its legacy, which included a now defunct website and a series of art commissions. Hipperson's fundraising efforts were successful, and by the time the camp officially closed, 3 sculptural monuments had been installed on the site. Peace Campfire and Spiral Waterstone by Michael Marriott in the Helen Thomas Memorial Peace Garden in honor of the only protester known to have died at Greenham after being run down by a police horsebox in 1989. And Broken Symmetry by Michael Kenny, unveiled in 1999 after the artist's death, which is not illustrated. More sculptures were since installed, including changes by Gudrun Nielsen, commissioned through a Greenham Common Trust competition 2 years earlier. All 3 photographs are from the sculptor's website, and the 2 on the right are presented side by side, casting the site's military history and specifically the runway of the airbase, once the longest in Europe, as an inspiration for the folding, unfolding sheets of steel. In the 9 plinths, the Icelandic artist recycled concrete and reinforcement taken from the airfield's former runway after it was dug up to restore the common. The airfield is also evoked in the steel forms, representing, quote, the creation and dismantling of a fighter plane, according to the artist, or in my view, the dynamics of takeoff and landing and the endless capacity of the land to accommodate change. As Hipperson took care to explain in her fundraising correspondence and press releases, the commemorative and historic side towards which she was working wasn't the only nor the first attempt at a Greenham monument. Women for Life on Earth, the original group who marched from Cardiff to Greenham in August 1981, commissioned Maltese sculptor Anton Agius to make a work representing a woman marcher holding a toddler, holding a dove, with the initiative of banner artist and Greenham veteran Thalia Campbell, who had come across Agius's work on her travels. The work was officially unveiled in its now permanent location in Cardiff City Hall in 2003, with what Campbell describes as an inclusive event attended by Greenham women, peace activists, as well as military personnel and politicians. The mother and child composition of the sculpture was determined by Campbell in consultation with Women for Life on Earth and the artist, and exploits a common iconography that I have discussed previously and will not do so here. Around the woman's waist are broken chains, a nod to suffragette activism, and also to the earliest performative actions at the airbase when some women from Women for Life on Earth chained themselves to the perimeter fence. Pacifist maternalism proliferated, was debated, and ultimately transformed at Greenham, not least in the performative recreations of social reproduction rituals by Shirley Cameron and Evelyn Silva, which again, I can come back to, but there's no time. It is almost certain that both Campbell and Agius were aware of Shin Hongo's sculpture at the Hiroshima Memorial Park, and there is much to explore about their complementary poses, horizontality over verticality, survival versus prevention, but again, there's no time to do so now. Although the monuments discussed so far were not to the peace camp in its longevity and anarchic diversity, but rather to particular groups and events, they still appear far removed from the thoroughly postmodern, DIY, often performative and precociously craftivist aesthetics of the peace camp. In papers donated to the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths and in her oral history interview for the Imperial War Museum, Campbell refers to some of the selection criteria for Agius's commission, including durability, and reading between the lines, the need to be immediately and unproblematically recognizable by all as a monument more than a work of art. The distinction between the two is complex and questionable. Both create meaning and stage an experience, but the meaning of a monument is first and foremost commemoration, and the experience is remembrance, or at least it's supposed to be. In the context of social activism, I suggest that monuments make a poor commemorative medium. They might even be an example of outsourcing and fixing the work of remembering so that we can finally forget. The Freudian principle that we keep repeating things that we cannot bear to remember is turned inside out in durational live art that ropes repetition into the service of communal public remembering. Such works perform a shared remembering that is demanding, labor-intensive, and fundamentally co-produced, sustainable only insofar as we're prepared to do the work. Nina Wakeford makes work that begins with the unfinished business of past social movements and the challenges of revisiting the energies that these movements created, in her own words. Her works often involve singing as a way of attaching herself to objects or images. This iteration of her durational performance with film, originating in 2016, took place in April 2019 on the roof of the Greenham Control Tower and was commissioned for the artistic program Uncommon in Voices and Non-Communal Bodies, curated by Mayan Shelef and Sarah Spies for Reading International 2019. In their project, the curators explore, quote, the voice and the body in and as a collective, and the ways in which their relational assemblages resist uniformity while nurturing group work. Wakeford converses with existing memorializations of the Peace Camp and the scholarship of Sasha Roseneal, who's also her partner in life. The film includes thousands of images, archival photographs of the camp, and ones of forget-me-nots from the nearby Memorial Peace Garden, which is visited in 2016 by the artist the year that the project started. According to Suzanne Clausen, the performance combines this footage with words from first-person accounts of women who were interviewed in Roseneal's study of the Peace Camp, alongside archival documents and a song. Re-performed in the control tower and relayed to the audience below, the flowers and the words of the women are broadcast across the landscape, where previously the women themselves were surveyed. It is fitting that Greenham should be celebrated in song, and I regret that this visual presentation cannot capture its famous sounds, laughter, ululations, feminist and anti-war songs, both original and adopted and adapted, and the haunting noise of the perimeter fence being shaken. Wakeford combines singing with speech of a markedly different rhythm. She recites lists, such as Appendix 1 from Roseneal's Disarming Patriarchy, which captures a variety of data from her Greenham women interviewees, including crucially sexual identification, self-identification, I should say, before and after engaging with the Peace Camp. Tabloid praise hysteria about the conversion of straight women to lesbianism is here rendered as sociological data, feminist legacy, and a moving celebration. I have long been grappling with the unhelpful duality between maternalism and queer feminism at Greenham. Women with children, even in their representations, play with established mother and child iconographies, even if their representations play with and into established mother and child iconographies, are no evidence of the former, i.e. maternalism, and Greenham children bring their own perspectives to its memory. Richard de Domenici made a series of works in video, performance, and their combination in and since 2008, thanks to a commission by Helen Cole for New Greenham Arts, including a residency at the base. In his videos, de Domenici reflects on his experience of visiting the Peace Camp as a child with his mother, Jessica Richardson, splicing together Richardson's Super 8 films of the camp with footage he shot himself using the very same camera. His films include an ironically melancholic peregrination around the camp set to Madonna's song, This Used to Be My Playground, and humorous recreations of policing at Greenham with the artist's regular collaborator and director of Colchester Arts Centre, Anthony Roberts, playing the policeman. Another film shows the artist in a bright yellow skelk bag, chosen to keep him warm in his residency, but also evoking hazmat suits and Greenham women's sleeping bags, digging for the wreckage of a plane reportedly carrying nuclear weapons, which caught fire at Greenham in 1959, and playing crazy golf with the same policeman, inspired by the arrow markings and holes in the floor of the preserved decontamination chambers. This film is projected in his cabaret performance set to another pop song, Nena's Cold War anthem, 99 Red Balloons. At the beginning of the performance, de Domenici releases 99 red balloons to the audience, inviting them to inhale helium and sing along with him in high voices that sound almost childlike. Cold War childhood is no longer the object of memory, but an eerie recreation through a chorus of inebriated children. All these different iterations have singing and the skelk bag in common. The skelk bag is practical, it is symbolic, and it gives the artist a hefty silhouette as he wanders through the gorse of the common. In function and appearance, it is reminiscent of Lucy Order's refuge wear and also of another character from pop culture, Lala of the Teletubbies, a non-verbal cyborg with a monitor embedded in her abdomen who lives in a bunker on some green and pleasant land. But scalp bags are not made for hot clubs. And as Amy LeMay, co-founder of Ducky, as many of you will know, and regular MC, invites the Domenici to take a bow, the crowd chants, off, off, off. And finally, the artist concedes. This final act of self-exposure is in keeping with the Dionysian atmosphere, but also thoughtful and deliberate. It breaks the spell of the Cold War children's chorus. The Domenici is all grown up now. We've all survived, and the nuclear holocaust has been averted, at least for tonight. Thank you.